The Jets have begun OTAs. What's going on with Aaron Rodgers? And some updates from Robert Saleh. That's ahead today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, May 23rd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, Jets OTAs are underway. This is the part of the offseason program. Players arrive at Florham Park to conduct offseason practices, and we have some updates on the Jets. Aaron Rodgers in particular. Robert Saleh also provided us with some updates on various things happening around the team. That's what we're going to talk about on today's show. And these OTAs tend to generate a lot of hype, and I would argue that in many instances, the news that comes out of these OTAs gets overhyped. And I think the reason for that is we're at a point in the NFL calendar where there's just really not a lot going on. You know, when we get to the fall, we have games happening. So you don't really focus that much about what happens on the practice field. During the offseason, in the early parts of the offseason, you could speculate about free agency, and then free agency happens. And then once free agency begins to slow down, we have the draft to talk about. We could talk about which players the Jets could draft. We could break down prospects. Well, now the draft's in the rearview mirror, and there might be a signing or two, between now and training camp, and there might be a trade or two between now and training camp, but there's really not a lot going on. So I think that many times what happens at these practices gets overblown because think about it. If we're in like September or October and you found out some guy was having a huge practice, would you care? No, because you're focused on games. But we don't have much else to talk about right now. So the discussion that suddenly turns to practice and it's all there is to talk about. So what happens here, I think, gets overhyped quite a bit. And another thing that's important to understand is these practices, aside from what's usually a 3-day mini camp, these practices are purely optional. So this is the time of year where you get analysis. Who's there? Who's not there? You have to remember it's optional. Players don't need to go. Players have negotiated the right to not show up to these offseason practices. And my general view on this is, people always like make a big deal of everybody's there. Well, it's a great thing for the team. Or if somebody doesn't show up, oh, what's going on with that guy? You have to remember that these are professional athletes. These are guys who understand how to get prepared for the season. These are guys who are all going to be in great shape by the time training camp comes around. I used to say this time of year that, it's okay if you don't show up as long as you're in great shape by the time you show up to training camp. Well, what NFL player doesn't show up to training camp in great shape? So for all these reasons, I think what happens during these OTAs gets overblown. And perhaps nothing's been more overblown this week than the coverage of Aaron Rodgers. And I understand it. Look, the Jets, social media departments, they got to put out content. So they're tweeting out all these videos about Rodgers. And, you have members of the media breathlessly breaking down his statistics in, the 7-on-7 drills and other drills. Look, it's practice. As Allen Iverson so eloquently put it 23 years ago, we're talking about practice. Rodgers, however, did give us some news, and Robert Saleh also provided us with a similar update. And they indicated that Rodgers is practicing fully. There are no limitations on him, which is to be expected. If you follow the typical curve for a player coming off an Achilles injury, this would be the point where, you wouldn't expect there to be any limitations on him. And this is also in part because there's no contact on the quarterback at practice. It doesn't matter which stage of the year you're at. Quarterbacks cannot be hit in practice. And that kind of takes down the physical requirements to play. And the fact you can even go back to late last season when the Jets activated Rodgers, or they designated him for return, then they activated him to the roster. But even though they didn't play him in games, that's because there's a difference between practicing and playing, especially at the quarterback position. Now, in this day and age, there really aren't many intense practices. If you went back decades, practices used to be intense. Practices, in many ways, simulated what you get during a game. That's not the case anymore. And again, that's something the players have negotiated with the owners. The players have negotiated kind of a lot of the tough practices out. And even the quote unquote padded practices these days, they don't have the same intensity that they had decades ago. And even if they did, you wouldn't be able to hit the quarterback. So all this is to say, you can get breathless about Rodgers' stats, in these drills, or you can go crazy about how good he looks, or the Jets I think tweeted out a video about some no look pass Rodgers through. These practices are not simulating a game situation, and because of the lack of hitting, they tend to benefit the offense. And again, it's practice, so I'm not going to go crazy because Aaron Rodgers looks good in practice. What we can say is that by all accounts, it sounds like the recovery from the injury is coming along well. That's something to look for. That's something that's important. And it's not a surprise because of the lack of intensity of practice, but it doesn't sound like there have been any setbacks. And that's something that's really, really important for the Jets this season because they need their quarterback. Last year, this is, I hope that you tune in for more insightful analysis than what I'm about to give you, but the Jets could really use their quarterback for more than 4 plays this season. So by all accounts, it sounds like Rodgers is on track. You would expect him to be back week 1. There shouldn't be any issues there. It sounds like, he's kind of back to his old form. He's probably, the Achilles injuries, especially for an older quarterback, they're going to have a lingering aspect to them. Rodgers is probably not going to be super mobile going forward, but to the extent Rodgers is going to be close to 100%, it sounds like he's getting there. And because the Jets activated him at the end of last year, I mean, you had to know that by May he'd be fine. He may not have been ready to return to the lineup back in December, but the fact that they felt fine with him on the practice field then, I mean, I'm not even sure it's necessarily the biggest shock in the world that Rodgers is ready to go right now. And the other things to watch this is one of those things where I know what I just said. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these things can matter. It's just they tend to be overhyped, kind of like the schedule release. There are things we could take from the schedule release, which happened a couple of weeks ago, but it just tends to get blown out of proportion. I think the same thing happens with these practices. There are some things worth watching. I think one of the things that these practices can be useful for are Rodgers developing chemistry with the receivers. It's not going to be game chemistry. That'll come along, as we get into the season. But anytime you have a chance to work with receivers, anytime Rodgers has a chance to kind of collaborate with receivers, talk about how you run a certain route against a certain coverage. All right, you're going to cut this off a yard short, things along those lines. It can be a benefit. Last year in training camp, it sounded like he and Garrett Wilson really developed a rapport. And this year, there are a couple of new receivers. Malachi Corley is one of them, and hopefully you'd hope Rodgers kind of takes him under the wing because Corley's got a lot to learn about the finer points of route running. And having a quarterback like Rodgers, if he buys in, and by all accounts, everybody around the team seems to think Rodgers has embraced a leadership role ever since he was acquired last year. Rodgers is the type of guy who can be a good asset for a young receiver. And we know Rodgers is a tough guy to work with for young receivers in many cases because he demands receivers view the game, on the same level he does. But at this time of the year in May, this is an opportunity for him to kind of show, for him to kind of lead, for him to kind of show Corley the ropes. And then there are some other guys out there perhaps Rodgers can develop chemistry with. So these are the things worth watching. It's not so much, some video of some highlight reel pass. These are smaller things, and it's brick by brick. You're building it slowly over the course of the next couple of weeks, and then once we get into training camp, is it the type of thing that's going to change the team? No. Would it be a big deal if Rodgers skipped a couple days? No, of course not. It's OTAs. We're talking about practice, but these are the little things that can help the team incrementally prepare for the 2024 season. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will talk about another key member of the Jets. We just talked about one of the most important members of the team, the quarterback. Well, the head coach actually offered us some updates on some various happenings around the team, and we'll go into those as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Our episode today of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. When it comes to your financial future, you think you've done it all. You've saved, you've researched, you've invested all that you can. Now you need to take those investments to the next level by using what every financial great uses, Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you the tools and the data you need in one place. They are the number one finance destination, providing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective of what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. With a community of over 90 million users each month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And once you're done with Locked On Jets, check out Locked On Sports Today. You may be tired of watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long. You may have to turn down the volume with all that shouting. Well, Locked On Sports Today is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, it is OTAs for the Jets. We're in the middle of that. They are underway, another phase of the offseason program. And if you're not familiar with the offseason program, essentially the Jets are allowed to have, and every other team in the league, they're allowed to have a certain number of offseason practices, and they ramp up through the course of the offseason. The beginning phase of the offseason program, it's really just kind of a couple of drills teams are allowed to do. And then OTAs are things that resemble a regular practice. And then eventually you'll get to like a mini camp, which is probably closer than anything you'll get during the offseason to a real practice. So the Jets are in the middle of this, and there are days where the media comes in and is allowed to view it. There are some practices that are open to the media, some practices that are closed to the media. Earlier in the week, Robert Saleh spoke to the media, and he offered updates on a few matters. Now, one of the things he offered an update on was Aaron Rodgers' progress. He said that Rodgers is doing everything. So we talked about that in the first segment. So another confirmation, Rodgers himself indicated that he's feeling pretty good. That especially the Achilles is feeling good, but the arm's also feeling pretty good. So Robert Saleh, indicating that Rodgers, is pretty much full speed ahead at this point. Rodgers is going to adapt to life after the Achilles injury. I mean, I think his game will have to change in some ways. I think he'll probably be more of a pocket passer than he has been at any other point in his career. But it sounds like there are no issues right now. There are no limitations on Rodgers, which is a good thing. Saleh gave us, I thought, actually a pretty interesting point when he talked about the Jets bye week. Now, the Jets have a bye. Their bye is at the end of November. And one of the reasons this is interesting is that the Jets have a week 5 game in London. And generally speaking, the NFL gives teams the option to have their bye week after their game in London. And most teams tend to take it. But the NFL does give you the option. So if you ask for it, the NFL will say, sure, you can have your bye week after the game in London. It's one of those things to help teams reacclimate to the United States after being abroad. Usually, I think London's 5 hours ahead of the East Coast of the United States, if I recall correctly. There are some teams I know that pass on it. Of course, famously, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, the Green Bay Packers with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback played a London game against the Giants and then decided they wanted the Jets the next week. And the Jets went into Green Bay and blew the Packers out. So the Packers probably regretted that. This year, the Jets do not have their bye after the London game. They actually play a Monday night game the next week against the Buffalo Bills. So the Jets followed it up with a tough game, but they do get an extra day to prepare. So maybe that'll help the Jets reset their body clocks after they return from London, because they don't play till the next Monday. And while the week after a Monday night game can be difficult because you're on a short week, it actually, I think, is helpful for the Jets to have an extra day to prepare for the next game after they return to London. So instead of Sunday, they play Monday night, gives you an extra day after you return from London. Well, Saleh talked about this, and he indicated that the team expressed a preference to have a later bye because they wanted the team to be able to get fresh for the stretch run. And this is always a bit of a dicey question. I've been pretty vocal about this in the past, and I don't have a ton of conviction with this because there's no data that backs this up. But generally speaking, I always prefer having the later bye. And it's for the reasons Saleh laid out. It's just the season's a grind. I mean, the season's a grind if you're a fan. But for players, after, you have, 18-week stretch, you have 17 weeks where you have these elite athletes, these enormous guys, these guys with incredible strength pounding on you, play after play after play after play, 70, 80, maybe 90 plays in a game. The hits add up. And that's especially true as players age. As they get older, players, it just becomes more than anything, from what I understand from guys who have played in the league, it becomes more difficult to recover. It's not so much that it's not so much that you have a specific injury. It's just the pounding takes a toll on you, and it becomes difficult to recover from week to week. I remember the famous linebacker Ray Lewis, one of the all-time greats at the linebacker position. He played until his late 30s. I remember him saying during his last season, when he was in his late 30s, after playing such a physical game for such a long time, that once he got late into the season, it took him 15 minutes to get out of bed in the morning, just because it's such a grind through the course of the season. And the Jets are a team that I think more than most teams is leaning on some older players this year. They have a lot of guys who are very accomplished players, very good players, but older players. And I suspect this was part of the calculation behind the Jets looking for the later bye this year, because they have so many older players. You never know when the best bye week is truly. I've mentioned this in the past, that back in 2015, so although 9 years ago, the Jets played an early season game in London against the Miami Dolphins, and they had their bye after the London game that year. And it ended up being like perfectly timed, because they had some key players like Chris Ivory and Eric Decker suffer early season injuries, and that bye week helped them get healthy. And Jets went on a run the rest of the way, and they ended up winning. Fell short of the playoffs because they played a horrible game in the regular season finale, but they went on to have a successful season. They won 10 games that year, and I think part of the credit goes to their early season bye, which just ended up being well timed. You can never predict when injuries are going to happen, but I think generally speaking, in a neutral situation, getting that week of rest later in the season, after a lot of the hits have added up, after a lot of the damage has been done, getting that week off for the stretch run, I think it can be a positive thing. So to the extent like I can have an opinion on this, I tend to like where the Jets mind was at in this situation. And Saleh gave another interesting point, kind of interesting point, where he mentioned that the Jets will be more likely, and this is actually something that was reported earlier in the offseason, but Saleh indicated that the Jets may have Sauce Gardner shadow the other team's top receiver more frequently. It's not going to be an every week kind of thing, but the Jets will be more apt to have Sauce Gardner travel with the other team's number one receiver, whether he goes to the left side or the right side. At this point, typically, through the first 2 years of his career, Sauce has usually played on the left side while DJ Reed's played on the right side. And Jets are probably going to mix it up a little bit more this year. People go crazy about this stuff. I don't think it's as big of a deal, in part because the Jets play mostly zone on the early downs. So if you're playing zone, your matchup depends on who goes into your area anyway. If you line up on the right side, the receiver who lines up on the outside on the right side is more likely to be the guy that ends up in your area. So it will have an impact, but I don't think it has I don't think it's as big of a deal. I think there may be a game or two on the schedule where it makes sense, where maybe Sauce just matches up stylistically better with a certain type of receiver, and DJ Reed matches up stylistically better with another type of receiver. But I actually think like this is something that's being a little overrated in the fan base. And while we're on the topic of playing in the secondary, Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich both had some things to say about the safety position. It's viewed as the weak point on the Jets roster, and they offered some ideas on what the Jets might do at that position here as we continue on this Thursday. And we'll get to that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Rangers fans, I'm sorry, not a great start to the Eastern Conference Finals last night for them, but we have a Game 2 coming up. Game Time is the place to go for your seats as the Rangers continue on their playoff run. All you do is you just pull out your phone or mobile device, a couple taps, and you have amazing deals, last-minute tickets, and you get the view from your seat before you buy, so that way there are no surprises when you walk into the arena. It's good for Yankees and Mets games. It's good if you want to go to a Jets game this year. Game Time is the place to go for NFL tickets. I've used Game Time myself. It's incredibly easy to use, and I just can't believe some of the deals I've gotten on this app. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We are talking about OTAs, and beyond that, we're talking about some of the insights the coaching staff has given us on the team during OTAs. As I mentioned, Robert Saleh discussed some various aspects of the team with the media. a few days ago, earlier in the week, and Robert Saleh confirmed that at the safety position, which is generally viewed as the weak link on the defense, that there is an open competition for starting roles. Chuck Clark, Tony Adams, and Ashton Davis are all considered part of that mix. And the Jets signed two of these guys this offseason. Clark and Davis were both re-signed. Both were technically on the roster last year, although Clark missed the full season because he suffered an injury in the offseason. Davis had a pretty strong year last season, but it was in a part-time role. And Jeff Ulbrich also mentioned that Isaiah Oliver, who the Jets signed this offseason from San Francisco, who previously had been a slot corner for the 49ers, actually was benched during the last season. The Jets view him as more of a safety than a cornerback. So Isaiah Oliver is another guy who could be in the mix. And when the Jets signed Oliver, I kind of speculated that maybe there'd be some sort of positional move because the Jets like playing fast at the linebacker position. And I know I just said that Oliver is moving to safety. Well, here's the thing. When we're talking about slot corners, safeties, in the box safeties, and linebackers, their role on a given play isn't as big as people think. Because generally speaking, if you have a slot corner in, he's replaced a linebacker. So because of the way that the gaps are aligned, usually you have to give your slot corner a run assignment. You have to give him a gap to play against the run. And that's not true of outside corners, but your slot corner, because he's close to the formation, usually has to be part of your run defense. So his run assignment is kind of similar to what you'd give the linebacker he replaces. And we're talking about box safeties. Well, what's the difference between a box safety and a linebacker in today's NFL? In many instances, it's not that big. In the past, there used to be a big difference in these roles, which is why we call one linebacker, we call one a safety. But if you were starting from scratch, if you just began figuring out what positions exist in today's NFL, I don't think you'd have as big of a distinction between box, strong safety, I guess is what most people call it, but a box safety and a linebacker. Now, slot corners have a tougher assignment because they usually have to guard receivers in the passing game, whereas safeties and linebackers don't. Safeties and linebackers usually guard either tight ends or running backs out of the backfield in passing situations. And I think, moving Oliver there, I think the mindset is you're looking for a guy who has cornerback skills, but can also play kind of a safety role or maybe even a linebacker role because he's big. He's very physical. I think the Jets are hoping he kind of develops into a tackler. In fact, he started playing this. He actually was originally an outside corner early in his career when he played with the Atlanta Falcons. Then during the 2020 season, the Falcons fired Dan Quinn as their head coach, and they made some changes to their coaching staff. One of the changes they made during that season was Jeff Ulbrich, who's currently the Jets defensive coordinator, was promoted to be Atlanta's interim defensive coordinator during that season. And that's when Oliver moved into the slot. And a lot of people around Atlanta would tell you that was a point where Oliver played his best football. He was an early round pick. He was a former second round pick of the Falcons. He was kind of a disappointment. Then they moved him into the slot in 2020 and his play improved. And then, last year he moved on to San Francisco, didn't play quite as well. So, it's an open competition. And, there are some questions at the safety position. One, can Chuck Clark recover? He's coming off a very serious, he's coming off a knee injury that cost him the full 2023 season. Guy who was a good player in Baltimore, guy who was traded through no fault of his own. The Ravens just had a lot of good safeties. Their safety room was crowded. So they essentially just tried to trade Clark while they could get some value for him because he was entering the final year of his contract and they had guys that they really liked at safety position, including the great Kyle Hamilton. Another question, can Ashton Davis step into a bigger role? Ashton Davis, huge disappointments early in his career when he was playing kind of a full-time player. You go back to 2021. I mean, I actually remember researching an article from 2021 that Ashton Davis's missed tackles added a full half a yard to the Jets' average run defense per carry allowed in 2021. I mean, if Ashton Davis had not missed any tackles, the Jets defense would have been half a run better, would have had an average half a run better per carry, a half a yard better per carry. Last year, Jets played him closer to the line of scrimmage in the more constricted space. Davis played a lot better. He was in the middle of a lot of plays. He kind of mastered that move where you, as you're tackling a guy, you rip the ball out, a couple forced fumbles, a couple interceptions. Can Tony Adams improve? That's another question. We've talked a lot about Tony Adams. Mentioned him earlier in the week. If you're an everyday, you've heard me talk about Tony Adams. He's one of those guys that the Jets have been hyping up. And last year wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible. It was good enough that you say, okay, I don't feel bad with this guy being a starter. Question is, can he improve in year 3? And then Oliver, with Jeff Ulbrich, a coach who knows him well, maybe he step into a role? And for Oliver, the move to safety makes sense from the standpoint is that there aren't really many snaps to go around at the corner position because you have probably the best trio in the league with Sauce and DJ and Carter. So at the safety position, though, that's viewed as the weakness. So maybe Oliver can carve out a role there. And I view Oliver as kind of more of a hybrid player because he's big for a corner. He's especially for a slot corner. So I view him, you can view him as like a guy who's built more like a safety. And we know that the Jets like to play guys who are built like safeties and kind of linebacker roles like Sherwood or, Ashton Davis, who is kind of like a hybrid safety linebacker. So some interesting stuff happening for the Jets at the safety position. We'll have to see what direction they go in. And we still need to see. It's possible they could sign somebody still in the waning days of free agency. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.